The pen is mightier than the sword, indicating that the written word is more effective than violence as a tool for communicating a point. But why do so many still choose to use violence, such as war, to resolve their disagreements?
Andrew.
Oof. Well, it's a very good question, and I don't think I have an answer for it. If I did, I'd probably be getting paid more than I am as a journalist. But I think it's an easy way to act upon an emotion, to act out anger. In the case of the war in Afghanistan, I think one of the first mistakes was going in as quickly as we did, although it was a so-called legal war. It was sanctioned by the UN Security Council. I think the basis for the original invasion was too heavily predicated upon revenge, and that means that any diplomacy that could have taken effect before then wasn't given a chance. Any learning about the country and the culture and the people and the foe was not given a chance to occur, and the results speak for themselves now.
Well, you look at your work, and we're talking about words here, but you've written a book about your experience, but the power of your images as well, which often speak, as we know, more loudly than words. Did you feel as if that was getting through, as if that was a way of connecting through the violence or revealing something about the conflict?
I'd like to think that what I was able to convey in Afghanistan that was different from a lot of the photographers who'd been in Afghanistan before me and photographed the war itself, the conflict, the combat, was to show a side of Afghanistan, the side of Afghanistan that wasn't at war. The faces of people who were living alongside the conflict, living on the front lines, but who weren't themselves taking part in the conflict. I think that seems to be what resonated for those who appreciated my pictures anyway.
Catherine?
I disagree with Andrew on a point here. I think the initial military action against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda was legitimate. It was an extraordinary, not only the Security Council, I think the General Assembly, with the exception of Saudi Arabia, Pakistan and China, endorsed that action. There was an enormous degree of unanimity. The first global leader to call Bush after the attacks on the towers was Vladimir Putin. So if you look back to that world on that day, the degree of repugnance at those attacks, and Andrew is much more steeped in life in Afghanistan, and I defer to that. I don't think the Taliban were ever going to hand over AQ, and nor that I don't think it gave them any joy to accommodate them after they'd seen what he'd done either. My problem wasn't the initial strike, and I wrote it while I was inside the army, and I sponsored works by people who took this view. I don't think we should have gone back for the nation-building phase. I think at the Bonn conference, and Karzai was the wrong leader, I agree, that we're mirror imaging ourselves there with an urbane, corrupt individual. He was the wrong leader for Afghanistan after the Taliban were deposed. But I don't think, looking at the evidence of the Russian war there, the Soviet war there, that nation building in that society was ever going to avail us. The surgical strike, removal of the training camps, driving AQ out of, and then they could have maintained surveillance using remotely piloted systems and local forces operating with special forces. You did not need to have the footprint we had there after 2006-07. It was a terrible mistake.
Brian, and then came Iraq, and of course you've mentioned that was part of your split with Labor. If there was a case, and certainly at the UN and after the attacks on the Pentagon and the World Trade Center, there was support for the initial invasion of Afghanistan. Iraq was a different thing, wasn't it?
Well, it's all linked. I think what we've never understood, what Lawrence tried to do, Lawrence Arabia, and even goes back further. There's a wonderful book by James Morris, now sadly no longer with us, Jan Morris, and he wrote the Pax Britannica, which was the story of the British first connection with Afghanistan and imperialism. And all of this...
The graveyard of empires.
That's right, and it is the graveyard of empires. It goes right back to trying to alter a society. When a society doesn't need altering, it needs recognizing. And that's the problem that's been right from the start. So it's a knock-on effect. So the Russian war in Afghanistan, it's all been very pointless because the fundamental root of it has never been examined. You know, this is a culture that we don't always understand, and we try to change it, we try to shift it, we try to make it, we try to rationalize it in our own terms. And I think we have to begin to understand how cultures evolve. And it's, I mean, what we did in the Middle East was dreadful. And what we did now, what Blair did and what Bush did and Cheney particularly and Donald Rumsfeld did in Iraq was horrendous because it disturbed a balance that had been created. You know, the balance between the Sunni and the Shia. And for all his horribleness, what's his name, Saddam, understood that. But also, as with all leaders, and certainly as you mentioned about the Prime Minister there is always this element of corruption. And it's the corruption that comes to the fore. And that's the tragedy of putting yourself in a position.
Coming back to the question, if I may, for a moment, though.
The pen is mightier than sword, or not?
I'd like to address that. And just as to leaving aside concepts of original sin, there's a wonderful study by a historian, Azar Gatt, who's written an anthropological survey. It's a work of great scope. We've been fighting since we were painting in caves. I don't know why. It's dispiriting, and when you talk about, as a species, are we at a point where it's bleaker than ever? I don't think the Bard would agree with you on that.
Well, it's interesting. It's interesting you mentioned the Bard because, of course, wasn't it in Hamlet that many wearing rapiers are afraid of those with goose quills?
And also Fortinbras, when he sees they're going to fight over a piece of land that's, you know, nothing. And Hamlet can't understand what this extraordinary soldier is doing. And of course, it's one of the central debates in his life. You know.
We have but 1/10,000 of those men in England who do no work this day.
Yeah.
Deborah, it's interesting, of course, we reflect on the Australian experience and we're still dealing with 200 plus years of colonisation and invasion and conflict in our own land. If we're talking about the pen being mightier than the sword, what does something like a voice to Parliament, which we'll be voting on in the term of this government, deliver in terms of being able to tell the truth about history?
Yeah,
is it strong enough?
I think we have to recognise that not everybody gets a pen.
That's right.
And that's the problem, you know, and without education on how to be a society, a cohesive society, without those lessons of empathy that should spring from our humanity, and they don't. Those people who are disenfranchised because they don't have a pen will turn to the sword or be manipulated to turn to the sword. So, bring it back to... So I just wanted to say there that I think the pen is mightier than the sword, but not everybody gets one, and we have to make sure that everybody gets one. Yeah? But this point about colonisation and our journey and our voice to Parliament, look, I'm going to say it right now. This is going to be my third referendum, right? 67. Can we count you as a human being and not a plant or an animal? That was the first referendum. Marriage equality, right? Second referendum, yeah? I'm engaged to be married now. My fiancé is here, and I'm telling you, what we went through to get to that point where love is love, that was punishing. And what was it, 67.8? Got us across the line. In Aotearoa, they sang, Pokari Kariana. I wept on that day when I watched Parliament. We got it across the line, and I wanted to celebrate more, and now this third referendum. okay, that's what we're going to do. But I really ask you, should I live through another referendum to tell me that I can be, that I can have a voice to Parliament? My ancestors have poured their knowledge into this land for 2,000, generations. I'm tired of the referendums, and there may be another one on the monarchy eventually. That's another conversation for another time, but we've got to have that voice. If it's to be representational, and that belonging I was talking about, that inheritance that we should all feel as Australians, really it's essential that there are first Australians in Parliament. And I'm glad to see there's a movement behind that. I just wish we didn't have to go through another referendum.
Marlon, is the pen mightier than the sword?
Well, I'm with Deborah. We both Aboriginal and Māori culture are both they're oral cultures. There's no pens in either culture.
That's right.
So, and when the New Zealand land wars were taking place, violence broke down between the Crown they couldn't impose their will. There was parity of population. There was just a massive resistance for Māori, and so they had to turn to the pen instead of the sword. And that's
the Treaty of Waitangi.
Yeah, yep, the Treaty of Waitangi. Well, after that, that they failed to uphold their obligations to the treaty, and then the land wars broke out, and when they broke down, sweeping confiscations and running everything through the native land court, putting everything through the courts, where it was expensive. It was there's the law came, the power of the law came in, which is another word for the pen, really, came in and took over. Yeah.
As a Māori performer, do you feel the weight of that too when you perform, and do you feel the privilege as well of the representation of Māori people?
I do. It's a responsibility, and I'm very humbled by it, but I'm very open and honestly curious about my own personal journey through being Māori and what it means to me, and it always has to be, as an artist, it always has to be inward outward, I think, and that it does come in conflict sometimes when you're representative of seem to be representing a culture, because no one can do that fully. No single person can do that.
So true.
So I have a responsibility to myself first as an artist, and then as a Māori, and from then on out.